Before we dive too deep into the functions of behavior, it is important for us to come up with common language surrounding behaviors. When we decide on the language we will use, this takes out the issue of adding too much emotion to student behavior when we are discussing it. It is very important for the adults to remove emotion when communicating about student behaviors. Allows us to be better problem solvers, to be more empathetic with the student, and think less about the impact on us and more about how we can support them. All behavior is a form of communication. This is a very common phrase you will hear in trainings, whether through the IU or any other services. Escalating behavior is the communication of increasing distress or discomfort in a student or anxiety. However, all of this is true, and it is important to remember that not all behavior is a form of purposeful communication. There are many times when a student is exhibiting an unwanted behavior that they are not doing so rationally. They are not doing so purposefully. Their body has become so dysregulated that they have entered into the fight or flight portion of the brain, and they do not have the rational sense to think, I am going to do X so that Y occurs. Often, as the adults who are de escalating or working with these students, it can be difficult because as human beings, we center ourselves in situations. It is very easy to slip into a pattern of a student is doing this to me. One very important mantra we would love for you to repeat to yourself throughout any de escalation is that a student is not giving you a hard time, they are having a hard time. They are probably not showing up at school that day thinking of all the ways they can ruin your day. So keep this in mind that behavior is communication, and we can use it to really dig into what's going on inside of a little student's body. However, it's also not always purposeful and rational. So keep that in mind that at times there might be students who are so dysregulated, they don't even know what they want or need. Challenging behavior is most common described as behavioral errors when we're talking about functions of behavior. We like this phrase because, again, it takes some of the emotion out. When we talk about behavioral errors, just like we would in a student's running record as they were reading, we would talk about their errors in their reading. So, using the phrase behavioral errors is one that is really common practice. Behavioral errors often occur because the students do not have the skills. They have an actual skill deficit that they cannot perform because they've never been taught explicitly. So if you have new kindergartners showing up to school and they've never been in a structured school setting, and you tell them, we're going to walk quietly in the hallway in a line with our lips zipped, there may be some kindergartners who have never experienced something of that nature before and don't even know what right looks like. So keep in mind there might just be skill deficits that need to be explicitly taught. Sometimes students don't know when to use skills. And this could be where they are not sure, is this a time when I'm supposed to be doing this? Or is this a time when it's okay for me to talk more? For many students who are switching from setting to setting, like many schools do, it can be hard to code switch what the behavioral expectations are. This is why we love systems level discussions about behavior because it creates common experiences and expectations for students across settings. Another issue can be that students have not been taught specific classroom procedures or routines. Again, the explicit instruction is required. And remember, hearing something once is not enough for most human beings. Many of us need lots of repetition. Skills are not taught in context. So it's really important that we think about the behavioral skills that are needed in a specific context or setting, and we allow students time to practice and rehearse and be corrected and retaught and all the opportunities, because the more repetition will be better, and the more often they can perform that skill in context, the better chance they'll have to do it independently moving forward. Another way that we think about behavior is through the ABCs of behavior. Again, this is a super common way to discuss behavior, so this is probably a review for many of you. But A stands for antecedent, B stands for behavior, and C stands for consequence. So essentially, when we see a student who has a behavior that is concerning or unwanted, we would identify what the antecedent was, which is what happened before the behavior. Then the behavior itself is measurable and observable. It's something they say or do. And then the consequence is what happens after the behavior. Unfortunately, it's not always as easy as that because a consequence is not necessarily a punishment. It's anything we do to reinforce a behavior, whether it's getting the student to perform it again because they did a great job and they're going to get acknowledgement, or if it's a behavior we don't want, the consequence could be something that is a punishment, but not necessarily. And often we reinforce things we don't mean to as human beings. Additionally, the antecedent is not always clean cut either. An antecedent could be something that happened right before the behavior that's super obvious, such as Johnny's neighbor yelled at him, so Johnny punched him in the face. The antecedent is the neighbor yelling, the behavior is punching him in the face, and then the consequence, I'm guessing, is the teacher saying, Johnny, no! The antecedent there was super obvious. However, there are things that happen that we don't see. There are events that happen with students that maybe they don't even understand how they feel about it. If a student was rushed at home, running late, stressed about getting on the bus, mom yelling at them, and then they show up at school and they're finally there, so they feel relieved, and then all of a sudden they're sitting in their language arts class at 9:30, 2 hours later, and they start to feel anxious and upset because of the morning routine that was off. The antecedent was something we weren't even aware of. This is just a really helpful framework and thought exercise when you have a student who's performing an observable, measurable behavior to consider what might be happening before, what might we be doing afterwards that is either increasing the likelihood of that behavior happening again or decreasing the likelihood of it happening again. When we consider antecedents, there's really two big categories we can put these into. The triggers are one type of antecedents. These are things that are environmental. They are events or communications, interactions that happen before the behavior, even though, again, sometimes there is a pretty significant delay. Some triggers are super obvious, such as a fire alarm for a student that's sensitive to noise, or recess getting canceled and changed to indoor recess because of bad weather, or losing in a football game. Those are all things we can really understand at face value as very clear triggers that became upsetting to the student. Each person is going to have different triggers. And the word trigger itself in today's climate and culture has become a little bit misused, where we talk about all the things that make us feel uneasy or anxious, and we're calling them things that trigger us. Just know that when we're talking about triggers here, we're thinking about specific events, interactions, um, communications with the student that potentially could cause unwanted behaviors. And knowing the trigger is half the battle, because if we can figure out the antecedent beforehand through a trigger, it becomes a lot easier to prep the student, to prep the team, potentially avoid triggers that we can, or help the student work through something. Signals are another thing that can happen during the behavioral antecedent, but these are behaviors the person exhibits before the more serious behaviors. So, if you think about a behavioral escalation as a mountain, this is happening pretty early on in the climb. We're not yet at the climax, worst part of the behavior, a big meltdown, a big frustration. Maybe it's a student who's clenching their hands tightly, or their shoulders get tense, or they're huffing and puffing in their breath. Maybe they vocally say, ugh, or do we have to do this? It's the little things that as you get to know students, you can pick up on their signals, which will be super helpful because we can start to intervene with the less intense behaviors and hopefully get really great at avoiding the more intense, big emotions that then become more disruptive to the student and the classroom setting.